Okay, so this is my short presentation on cognitive science and religion. We spent some time in class talking about the psychology of religion from the point of view of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. If you take intro to psychology at Georgia College, there's a good chance that Freud and Jung won't even come up and won't be anything more than a little side blurb on one page in your textbook. And the reason is that Freud and Jung are not scientists from the point of view of the definition of science that we learned about in middle school. That is, they didn't do experiments or establish hypotheses that could be tested or proven false by others. Freud and Jung's methodology was at its core interpretive. It was all about the interpretations of dreams, symbols, and myths, interpreting the dreams of patients, interpreting the symbolism of religious texts and religious art. You're more likely to find Freud and Jung in books on literary studies, or you're more likely to talk about Freud and Jung in a class on religion and literature than you are in a class on psychology. I know that there are a number of psychology majors in the class, and you've probably learned already that there's a distinction between getting a degree in psychology and getting a degree in psychiatry. You can get a PhD in psychology, which is either a clinical or a research degree, but getting a doctorate of psychiatry, a D-Psych, is really a whole other universe. Research universities do not offer Doctor of Psychiatry degrees. These are degrees that are offered by small programs, have a completely different system of accreditation. It's in a program on psychiatry, a D-Psych program, that you would learn about Freud or Jung. You decide if you're Jungian or Freudian, basically. But the point is that Freud and Jung are in a completely different universe from the scientists who inhabit a psychology department of a university today. When I'm referring to cognitive science, I'm talking about the study of the human mind by credentialed scientists ranging from evolutionary biologists to behavioral psychologists to neuroscientists who study the physical operations of the brain, its chemistry, its electrical activities, that kind of thing. So the broad field of cognitive science approaches to the study of religion is pretty wide ranging. There are, to begin, those who are looking at religion from the point of view of cognitive science with a sympathetic lens. People like Reverend Kusala doing experiments on meditators to try to prove that meditation can transform the brain, that it has positive effects of reducing anxiety and depression. There are other forms of neutral experiments in cognitive science which are attempting to explain what's going on in our brains physically when we're doing religious activities, trying to explain the function of religion as a kind of validation of Emile Durkheim's functionalist sociology. So, do forms of religious ritual actually improve group solidarity? Emile Durkheim said that it did, and he said that it produces collective effervescence and this group ecstasy that makes us want to keep getting together and do rituals again together and collectively affirm social norms. But Durkheim was relying on his own fieldwork observations and the observations of others to come up with this theory that remained within the realm of speculative anthropology. Some cognitive scientists today are working to bring theories of the functional utility and social importance of religious ritual into the laboratory in a way that we can test and verify the theory that the performance of ritual increases group solidarity. One example of an experiment I saw at the American Academy of Religion annual conference 2 years ago was one in which experimenters had two groups of volunteers, one group among whom had to perform with each other. They were all put in this room together and they had to perform with each other this Japanese tea ceremony, where they would, make the tea and pour it out for each other and clink their glasses. And the other group was just put in a room and they were supposed to talk to each other for 30 minutes for the same amount of time that the other group had done the tea ceremony. And each group was asked at the end to rate their level of affection that they had for the other subjects that they were in the room with. And on average, after this experiment was performed hundreds of times, the people who had done the tea ceremony reported having a greater amount of affection, feeling a greater sense of bondedness with these random strangers that they were put through this ceremony with. And the significance of doing experiments like this is to take what was for Durkheim a speculative theory about what's going on within the human mind, what kind of transformations we're undergoing during the course of physically spending time together in the context of a ritual, to give it some sort of validation from the point of view of empirical experimentation. And then at a broader level, theories about how it is that aspects of human religious thought and behavior might be a consequence of our evolution as a hypersocial species. And this category of theorists, at the end of the day, breaks down into two kinds. One being those like David Sloan Wilson, who think that religion can be seen in a positive light as exemplary of pro-social, cooperative human behavior that evolved as a mechanism for improving the chances of survival of small groups. And on the other hand, theorists who see religion as being a consequence of the way that our minds evolved to process and deal with information, but one which at the end of the day gives us a distorted picture of reality. And so, as such, stands as a limitation to our advancement in terms of rational and scientific thought. There are those among this category who think about religion as a product of evolution, who see religion as something essential to who we are. So David Sloan Wilson would be in this camp. And those who see religion as something epiphenomenal, extraneous, or accidental to certain cognitive processes or tendencies of our cognition that we evolve for other reasons. When we're talking about cognitive scientists saying that they can account for quote unquote religion through observable brain states or hypotheses in evolutionary biology, what are they talking about? Or what dimensions of religion do they think that they can explain? These range from things like the origin of morality and altruism and empathy. So attempt from the point of view of evolutionary biology to explain how caring for others, even to the point of self-sacrifice or endangering your own life, could be a mechanism of survival wherein we have to think about traits like empathy as having been selected for not at the level of the individual, but at the level of the group. So morality is one thing. One fixation of evolutionary biologists is the origin of consciousness or agency to inanimate things. So this is part of Jesse Baring's article for today, an attempt on the part of evolutionary biologists to say that our theory of mind or our evolved capacity to attribute mental states and thoughts to others is a necessary skill that we develop at a very young age that allows us to anticipate what other people might be thinking at any given time. But also in its hyperactive capacity, the theory of mind can attribute agency and mental states to non-persons or to inanimate or even imaginary things that some within the domain of cognitive science take to be an explanation for where it is that early animistic forms of religious imagination came from. There are some theorists such as Franz de Waal, who is a primatologist who worked with chimpanzees, who try to locate in non-human animals the origins of certain religious activities and certain religious feelings also. So one of Franz de Waal's observations was of what he saw to be ritual behavior in chimpanzees, some kinds of group behavior involving the suspension of group hierarchy momentarily when they're presented with this big feast that look to de Waal like forms of annual religious ritual. Jane Goodall described this chimpanzee activity of the celebratory throwing of big rocks into a river and some of the chimpanzees sitting around and watching the water splash up in what she described as a sense of awe, perhaps akin to the religious sense of awe that human beings feel in the presence of the divine. Jane Goodall sees it there present in this chimpanzee behavior. And finally, theorists who build on this idea of ritual as something rooted in our biology, extending on this to explain why ritual might be useful, either in the case of non-human animals, other hominids like chimpanzees and gorillas, and also in the case of us. How is it that early forms of religious ritual may have been not just important, but even essential in maintaining solidarity and community within the context of nomadic hunter-gatherer human societies? Obviously, there are some people who might be put off by the idea that components of their own experience that they take to be deeply and fundamentally meaningful to their own lives are somehow a product of evolutionary biology, to say that our idea of God is nothing more than a byproduct of certain brain states that we evolved as evolutionarily competitive animals is a perspective so foreign to many people's religious sensibilities that they might have a hard time engaging with scientific perspectives on religion and cognitive science in the first place. I should say also that the notion that scientists have some sort of preemptory ability to account for where religion comes from is scary, not just to people who are religious themselves, but also to scholars of religion, with religious studies being primarily dominated by textual scholarship, degrees in the history of religions and comparative religion, largely developed out of programs in theology at research universities, and as such, take as their starting point for the study of religion sacred texts in their original languages, from which they attempt to construct the original meaning of the text, put those texts in dialogue with subsequent commentarial traditions, and attempt to explain the history of reception of those texts by people of those faith traditions over time. So the entire discipline of religious studies is very much rooted in texts and their interpretation. How do we understand what religion means? We understand how people have interpreted over time the scriptures or sacred texts foundational to their own tradition. So the proposition that the most meaningful aspects of religious experience can be explained by putting someone in an MRI machine or hooking up electrodes to their brain and monitoring what happens when they perform a tea ceremony is the most radically outsider kind of interpretation of the significance of religion that you could really get. What I'm saying is that the cognitive science of religion is not only a foreign and intimidating way of approaching religion to religious people, but also to conventional scholars of religion who themselves are very deeply entrenched in a kind of interpretive, textual, philological approach to the study of religion and its significance. This is something that I can also say from personal experience, because I am someone who has come up in a history of religious program in a divinity school that used to be a theology program at the University of Chicago, and am trained as a textual scholar of religion, but nonetheless find cognitive science approaches to religious studies to be completely fascinating, and find myself open to the possibility that scientists might be able to answer questions about religion that I can't, that I and my colleagues really can't. And I'm completely open to that, and I find it to be a very interesting perspective. But I know that others in my field are generally wary, intimidated, and put off by the kinds of cognitive science approaches to the study of religion that I'm talking about today. Brandon Ambrosino in the How and Why Did Religion Evolve article today cites psychologist Robin Dunbar on reminding us about the important fact that although textual approaches to the study of religion predominate, we don't actually have any texts that are more than about 4 or 5,000 years old. And this completely ignores the fact that for most of human history, religions had a very different shamanic-like form, one without any gods or moral codes or scripture, and that while theology and scriptural-based forms of religions are only a few thousand years old and characteristic of post-agricultural societies, shamanic forms of religion, animistic religion, and forms of religiosity that preceded the great religions of the world that you would learn about in world religions class, the big five: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. People have been doing religious things for over 250,000 years. So if we want to think about religion not just in the narrow sense of, well, what's been going on in terms of the production of scripture and civilizational religion, we might say, over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, we have to think about the long history, the longue durée of human religiosity that goes way back into prehistory, way back into our pre-literary, pre-literate forms of social life. One project among modern cognitive scientists is to try to explain where the human tendency to attribute thought and agency to inanimate or invisible things comes from. Here we should distinguish two separate questions. One is the tendency to attribute thought and agency to gods with a lowercase g, the practice in shamanistic and animistic forms of religion to believe that spirits, gods, or deities inhabit trees, rocks, rivers, and so forth. And the other question is that of the origins of the idea of God with a capital G, which is, I think, a question on a different scale, because although God, in the biblical sense, appears on earth through various theophanies or embodiments in, say, the Old Testament, he appears as a burning bush and in various other physical forms, we don't, from the point of view of Jewish or later Christian theology, believe that, oh, God is contained within the burning bush, or God is contained within the clouds or the sky. That idea of God with a capital G is a much more diffuse and abstract notion, but still an attempt to derive a possible evolution of God with a capital G from gods with a small g isn't a question that's out of bounds for cognitive scientists. So even if their theories relating to the attribution of agency and thought to inanimate things in the context of animistic or polytheistic religion seem inadequate to explain the origins of a more theologically subtle monotheistic conception of God, cognitive scientists don't take the potential to explaining the genesis of the concept of God of the Bible from the point of view of evolved human cognitive processes off the table. Long before the 21st century, cognitive science of religion, speculation about locating the origins of the concept of God within the human brain is implicit in Renaissance art, as depicted in Michelangelo's famous fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, The Creation of Adam, in which the cloak and background figures framing God in the creation scene outline an anatomically accurate picture of the human brain. So even though people didn't have the tools that we have now experimentally to explore and test ideas like this in any sort of rigorous way, it's fascinating to note that for 5 centuries in the West, cognitive science speculation about the origin of God has been underway. I mentioned in class once before David Hume's speculative theory on the origin of concepts of deities in early polytheistic religion. Hume was a contemporary of Immanuel Kant, and whereas Kant believed that we had all of the important categories essential to processing the sensory information of the world re-implanted on our minds, what Kant calls the categories of the a priori, David Hume thought that we're born into the world with our minds a blank slate, tabula rasa, and that everything we know and perceive about the world is the product of our cumulative experience of it. Hume believed that we built up impressions, he called them, of the general outlines of physical things as we saw, touched, tasted, and smelled them from a very young age. So when we're exposed to trees for the first time when we're little kids, we gradually develop the impression of a tree, Hume says. When we experience people, we develop the impression of a person. And Hume thinks that our ability to reason about and imaginatively interact with the world comes about through a capacity to combine different impressions in novel ways within our imagination. This is essential, Hume thinks, for being able to reason about the world and imagine counterfactual scenarios that you haven't encountered before. But also, Hume believes that it is why it is so natural for people to combine certain impressions in a way that generates concepts of things that don't actually exist in the real world. So if you combine your impression of a tree with a person, the result you get is a thinking tree, an enchanted tree. And for Hume, this naturalness of reassembling basic ideas that we acquire from sensory experience, what Hume calls empirical experience, when extended into the realm of the fanciful, can account for a very early human tendency towards animistic religious imagination. Hume was a philosopher writing a century before the establishment of modern psychology, but his speculation regarding the earliest origins of religious thought with respect to the attribution of agency to inanimate things remains part of the toolkit of 21st century cognitive scientists in trying to account for the elementary forms of religious life. And this was the point of the article by Jesse Bering on our proven readiness to assign to inanimate things from a very young age the idea of agency or thought. And the experimental example was that of a 1944 experiment by these two Austrian scientists who put together this animated film with three black and white moving figures, a large triangle, a small triangle, and a small circle. And when participants watched the figures moving around on the screen for a while and asked to describe what they saw, most fell back on social human behavioral narrative. They were explaining how the triangles were acting in terms of their personalities. So the large triangles were seen as bullying the timid, smaller triangle, both of whom were seeking affection from the female circle. Bering also cites Albert Lamourisse's famous 1956 film Le Ballon Rouge, The Red Balloon, which is this kind of, postmodern art film where the little boy's walking around with this balloon that has a mind of its own. But he made 2 points. One was how easy it is for the audience to understand the emotions of this balloon, what it's doing. It feels lonely when it gets separated from the boy. And the other was that in this interview with Lamourisse's son Pascal, who played the little boy in the film, years later when he was 51 years old, Pascal said that he really thought when he was a 5-year-old kid making this film that the balloon was alive and that it had a personality. And in his memory, this balloon was an actual character with thoughts and feelings.
And the point for Bering is that, as for Hume, the adaptation of what we now call the theory of mind, or the ability to attribute thoughts, intentions to others as a kind of mental exercise from a very young age, really from when we're about 2 or 3 years old, is essential to being able to predict how others are going to react in a given social situation. This is why behavioral scientists now explain the fact that we have imaginary friends from a young age. So it's fun, but it also fulfills this very important adaptive purpose, that is being able to experiment in your own mind, even if you don't have any real friends, even if you don't have any brothers or sisters or friends or anything. You can experiment in your own mind with social scenarios. Okay, how would my imaginary friend so and so act in this situation? Well, let me imagine it. This is something useful and necessary, the theory goes, this kind of attribution of thoughts to non-existent or inanimate things, so that when we head out into the real world, where there are real stakes in terms of what happens in our social life, we are prepared for it. We have trained ourselves at a very young age by using our theory of mind.
The significance in relation to religion for Bering is that we possess from a very young age the inclination to attribute thoughts and agency to invented and inanimate things, which, following Hume's logic, is a possible explanation for the nearly worldwide universal human tendency to locate supernatural spirits in natural objects. One sort of default statement that I have observed undergraduate students making in discussions about religion and morality is the assertion that if there were not some threat of punishment and some promise of reward after we die, so heaven or hell, then people would have no incentive to act morally, and no one would. This is something that I hear people saying in the classroom and reading on response papers. This is an idea of human morality operating purely by means of divine incentive. I should say, first of all, that I'm not sure that this is an idea of morality that even works very well from the point of view of Christian theology, but furthermore represents a point of view that cognitive scientists think that can almost be disproven on the basis of available evidence. Cognitive scientists have amassed a database of evidence to attempt to account for the origins of things like empathy and altruism from the point of view of animal evolution. It was for Darwin and for scientists many years after him a struggle to explain from the point of view of Darwinian evolution how it is that altruistic or self-sacrificing kinds of behavior could be a positive adaptation. That is, isn't natural selection all about selfishness and survival? Don't you have a better chance of passing your genes along if you behave in ways that allow you to out-survive others, thereby getting more mating opportunities, having more babies, and passing more of your genes along? Shouldn't forms of behavior that, or forms of cognition that support forms of behavior that jeopardize yourself in an attempt to help others, be selected against? That is, shouldn't people who put themselves at risk in order to help others be more likely to be injured or killed, and as a consequence have less babies? It turns out that over the past several decades, researchers have developed models to explain, from the perspective of what they call multi-level natural selection, how it is that altruistic tendencies can develop not just in humans, but in animal populations in general. And here it's important to remember that, of course, selfish behavior is a hallmark of animal life, but also in many species of animals, cooperative behavior is also very common and is observed in a wide variety of contexts. To explain the function of altruism in multi-level natural selection, an example that's often used is the example of gophers or prairie dogs, who live in little tunnels out in the plains of the central Midwest United States, and who have this institution of everybody coming out during the day to search for their grasses and seeds and nuts and what have you, while one prairie dog stands up and doesn't eat and keeps watch for any hawks that might be flying overhead. And when the sentinel prairie dog sees a hawk, he makes a loud chirping alarm. He goes, "Rip, rip, rip, rip." I don't know. Maybe I'll find a video on YouTube to put right here. I can't really do the sound, but anyways, he makes this chirping alarm sound so that all the other prairie dogs know that there's a hawk there, and they should all go into their burrows. The issue that arises here is the fact that by doing the chirp alarm and letting everyone else know that the hawk is there, the sentinel prairie dog puts himself or herself at elevated risk for being eaten by the hawk. The hawk can zero in on the chirping prairie dog, and the prairie dog has to stand up longer than everybody else while he or she is doing the warning signal, and puts himself or herself at greater risk. The question is, shouldn't any prairie dogs who have the instinct to engage in this kind of altruistic or self-sacrificial behavior, putting themselves at risk in order to help the other members of their troop, shouldn't this instinct be selected against over time? So shouldn't the desire to be a sentinel prairie dog be selected out of any given group, as altruistic prairie dogs are eaten by hawks at a higher rate than everybody else? And the answer that scientists give is that you have to consider selection of genes not just at the level of the individual prairie dog, but also at the level of prairie dog communities or groups. So while it's true that altruistic prairie dogs might get eaten at a higher rate than the selfish prairie dogs, groups or bands or communities of prairie dogs that have sentinels in them tend to outsurvive groups that don't. So in a group of prairie dogs where everyone just goes out and forages, no one sees the hawk, there's no sentinel prairie dog to warn everybody that the hawk is coming, a greater number of prairie dogs in total are at risk to predation from the hawk, are at risk to being eaten by hawks, whereas groups where there are some sentinels are going to have a higher rate of survival as a group, which means that even though altruistic prairie dogs are individually at greater risk, they're more likely to pass on their altruistic genes, because it's not as if they get eaten by the hawk every time. They're not like lemmings or something who are being eaten by the hawk every time they signal. They just have a slightly elevated risk of getting eaten by the hawk. But because they live in these groups which are more successful on the whole, because through the act of warning their fellow groundhogs in their community about the hawk that they need to go and run and hide, their communities have a much higher survival rate overall than communities where there is no altruistic signaling. The genes which motivate this kind of altruistic behavior still remain in circulation within these prairie dog communities over the generations. That's not to say that every prairie dog is an altruist, or every prairie dog has this really strong instinct to forego its own lunchtime in order to watch out for hawks. There might be within a prairie dog community a broad spectrum between extremely altruistic prairie dogs and sociopathic prairie dogs who don't care about any of the other prairie dogs at all, who will never volunteer to be sentinels. And the prevalence of altruistic genes might fluctuate within a given prairie dog community over time. So sometimes there might be more altruists, and as the altruists get eaten more and more by hawks, there might be less altruists in the next generation prairie dogs. But from the point of view of multi-level rather than individual selection, we still see how the genetic predisposition for altruism is something that is preserved within a community over time. A certain distribution of those who are predisposed towards highly altruistic personalities, and some who are predisposed towards highly sociopathic personalities, is still something that we find very, very exactly in human populations as well. And as behavioral scientists learn more and more about the root causes of psychopathy and sociopathy, they've come to appreciate that there is a strong genetic component to it. That is, that people are highly disposed to psychopathy and sociopathy by birth, and whether they become psychopaths or sociopaths then has a lot to do with their early life experiences and any clinical interventions. But it is now something of a consensus within the scientific community that people who are strongly altruistic, strongly self-sacrificing, and people who are maximally selfish, who are sociopaths, are so in large part because of their genetic profile. Just as some theorists have sought an evolutionary account of morality and altruism, others have sought biological origins for the fundamental sorts of behaviors that constitute religious community and ritual life. Just as from the point of view of multi-level selection, we can understand the evolutionary utility of putting yourself at risk for the sake of potentially helping out members of your own group, could there be some sort of social purpose or some sort of purpose that increases the chances of the survival of a given group within the elementary forms of religious life, as Emil Durkheim might call them? Could there be some sort of evolutionary purpose for the universal human phenomenon, so near as we can tell, of people collectively getting together to say as a group that they believe in things that belong to the realm of the invisible, or that they believe in things that you can't necessarily see or touch, but that constitute the confessional terms of membership within the religious system of this group? And at this point in the discussion, I invoke the conformity experiments of Solomon Asch, which any of you who took Intro to Psychology would have learned about. This is a very famous set of experiments involving a single subject who is brought into a room with an experimenter and 5 people who are confederates of the person running the experiment. So one person is brought in thinking that they're in a group with other random people who had volunteered for the experiment, but in fact, they are the only one who's not a part of the experiment, who doesn't know what's going on. And the way it works is that the experimenter at the front of the room shows a series of slides with a number of vertical bars of different heights on them. And the group is asked to, one by one, point out which bar is the highest on the chart. And the experiment is set up such that everyone, Confederates included, for the first several rounds, pick out the obvious bar. Bar number 4 is the highest. Then, according to the plan established beforehand, the Confederates start to pick out, after a certain number of rounds, the Confederates start to pick out a lower bar on the graph. So they'll start to say, bar number 3 is the highest bar, right? And the point is to see what the unwitting subject does. What are they going to say? And in Asch's series of experiments, what happened generally was that the volunteer unknowing subject would still, for the first few rounds after the Confederates picked out a bar that was obviously not the highest bar, the subject would give the correct answer, but they would become visibly uncomfortable, start squirming in their chair. They were obviously uncomfortable breaking ranks with the other members of the group. And the punchline to this, and the fascinating thing, is that many subjects, after a few rounds of discomfort, would simply acquiesce to what the group was saying and say that the highest bar was whatever the other people in the room said, just to alleviate this discomfort of social nonconformity. When everyone in the room was allowed to write down their answers privately, the subjects had no trouble picking out the highest bar every time. So it wasn't a matter of like the bars were really, really close, just a millimeter off, and it was something questionable. It was just like the graph I'm showing you right here. The answer is very obvious. And Asch's conclusion is that the impulse towards social conformity overrides our willingness to say things out loud before our peers that are even very obviously in conformity with reality. Social conformity is a very basic human impulse. And to extend Asch's insights to early human group life, and the hypothesis is that pre-civilizational human beings probably lived in groups not much larger than 150. Transporting ourselves back to prehistory, pre-civilizational human life in the Stone Age, what was it really like back then? We can understand that early human bands made up of probably around 5 or 6 extended families competed with one another for resources, probably worked to avoid conflict when it was unnecessary, and practiced all kinds of forms of cooperation within the group, a division of labor between men and women, young and old, who were the most capable. But what would it mean for an early human hunter-gatherer band to accept a new person into their tribe or group, which obviously happened with some regularity, intermarriage between groups, or someone orphaned from one group needs to join another? How would you know that this new member had truly assimilated into your group and was trustworthy and was one of you, so to speak? It's here that rituals of affirmation of belief in the invisible can be seen to play an important role in the establishment of social bonds between in-group members. It might be a very important aspect of integration within a group to say that you, like everybody else in that group, accept some principle that is not visible to outsiders. That is, as a criterion for joining a group, as perhaps a kind of test of loyalty, would it make sense as a bonding exercise to get together as a group and say something that is immediately obvious to anyone, to say, okay, we're going to get together and say as a group that the sky is blue or that Taco Bell is delicious? Or would it make more sense as a criterion for joining the group to make some sort of oath, some confession of belief unique to the group in some sort of invisible principle, a god, a goddess, a form of magic, a mythological story of creation? What is important in this case is that the confession of belief isn't something that represents belief in the visible world or the obvious world or the world of logic, but precisely something that involves the opposite, affirmation in the belief in the invisible, the not obvious, the irrational. And so the deep and I think very unsettling implication of this kind of thought experiment is the possibility that religious belonging at its basis is not something that derives from carefully thought out reasoning about the world, but rather which derives from a necessity of the affirmation of group bonds, a very early principle in human life, and indeed, as you saw from the readings today, even before that, in pre-human hominid life, and which may have more to do with an evolutionarily derived impulse towards conformity than it has to do with rational decision-making and free choice. Finally, there is the normative question amid all of this. If religion is somehow a product of evolution, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is religion epiphenomenal, a mere spandrel or byproduct of the way that our mind has developed, and something that only impedes more rational and empirical means of knowing? Or is religion something indispensable and essential to who we are as human beings? David Sloan Wilson, in his Darwin's Cathedral, argues that religion has had an essential role in our development as a cooperative species, and gives several examples of group solidarity produced by a sense of religious belonging, which allowed fledgling or minority religious groups to outsurvive other contemporary groups. Notably here are those of early Christian communities in the Mediterranean, which would go on, of course, to represent the official religion of the Roman Empire by Constantine's times, but which began as a persecuted, very small minority. And another of his examples, that of the survival of Jewish communities in the medieval Christian and Islamic world. Wilson argues that like Jewish communities, early Christian communities imposed strict moral demands on their members. And that strictness was actually attractive to early Christians. It gave structure to life within a Roman world that it was in moral chaos. Wilson, at the end of his book, goes on to highlight a number of demonstrable pro-social and positive effects resulting from religious community. And he gives some examples like lower rates of alcoholism among churchgoers in certain American cities, and lower rates of crime and violence among churchgoers. The point being that we have, in some instances, empirical proof that the kinds of group bonds and expectations generated by being a member of a religious community have pro-social consequences. There is finally the biggest question from my own point of view: is not religion, but religious thinking, something unavoidable for us? It's impossible to know everything about the world, right? The world is a very complex place, irreducibly complex in some senses. And as such, we are required by necessity to create worldviews which simplify, which break things down into black and white, good guys and bad guys, good and evil. One of the points that I've tried to make in this class is that there are other paradigms of human activity that we don't ordinarily think of as being religious, but which contain religious aspects nonetheless. There are conservative and liberal theodicies, conservative and liberal accounts for why it is that bad things happen to good people. There are eschatological dimensions to belief in the liberal economy and the stock market. There are devotional elements to sports fandom and Kardashian obsession and so on. Could religious thinking be a feature of our limited and embodied existence as human beings? And as such, not something that has to be conquered or overcome, but which must be acknowledged for what it is, as something intrinsic to the human condition. I don't know if we'll get there on our discussion post today, but anyway, that's my 2 cents about it at the end. That maybe not, religion in the sense of like belonging to being a Christian or being a Muslim or being a Buddhist or whatever, but in the sense of condensing the world into a kind of view of, okay, this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing. Is that something that we can never step out of? Is it impossible to step out of not membership within a religious community, but modes of moral and ontological reasoning that could be considered religious? That's my own question that I don't have an answer to. So I will look forward to reading your exchanges on the discussion board with this very stimulating topic.